all verifiable evidence from archaeology, genetic analysis, carbon dating, burnt pollen remains, and disposition of volcanic ash showers, points to New Zealand having been first settled in the 13th century AD, during the era of widespread Polynesian ocean voyaging. This probability is confirmed by the discovery of Mare Island obsidian on Raoul Island in the Kermadec group, halfway between New Zealand and tropical Polynesia, which can have been left there only in the course of return journeys to one or more Pacific islands. The genetic diversity of Kermadec Kiori is further confirmation that those islands were a staging point for multiple voyages from both directions. Footnote: the suggestion that Kiori were in New Zealand earlier than the 13th century AD, see Chapter 1, is merely evidence of a possible Polynesian landing on the New Zealand coast. Coinciding evidence of settlement is conspicuously absent. Other problems, too, about the early dates for Kiori bones, such as the fact that they appear to precede even the human settlement of East Polynesia, have yet to be resolved. Returning to the text. It seems most likely that, matching the pattern elsewhere, New Zealand was located during a voyage of discovery and settled as a result of subsequent and deliberate voyages of colonization by several, possibly many, canoes. Geneticists and demographers have calculated that a population of 100 to 200 founding settlers, including at least 50 women, was needed for the Maori population to reach its estimated size of 100,000 by the 18th century. Analysis of Kiori mitochondrial DNA suggests that there were multiple colonizations by the rat in New Zealand, meaning many introductions, which in turn indicates a number of canoe settlements. The likely sequence of discovery and then settlement is also suggested by elements common to Maori tribal traditions, almost all of which speak of primary discoverers preceding the canoe voyages of organized colonization. The question of whether those named figures were responsible for the discoveries themselves, however, is complicated by the fact that, like Maoris, some of their names appear in island Polynesian traditions in similar roles. Thanks to the well-preserved evidence of material culture, stone adzes, bone fishhooks and harpoon points, there is no doubt that the major source of Polynesian immigration to New Zealand was the islands of East Polynesia. Precisely which islands may never be known for certain. The distribution of tools and materials uncovered by archaeologists reveals that at the time of the settlement of New Zealand, those islands, the Society, Marquesas, Astral and Cook groups, were part of what anthropologists call a regional interaction sphere, meaning that contact among them was extensive and frequent. It is likely, too, that immigrants heading for New Zealand set out within a short space of time from more than one of those island homes. Such a scenario is confirmed by the fact that New Zealand Kiori display genetic markers that link them to both the Society Islands and the Cooks, though not to the Marquesas. More than one scholar has suggested that pervasive differences between the pronunciation of North and South Island Maori, retained even as successive North Island tribes migrated to the south, may be another indication of different sources of migration from different islands. This diffusionist theory, however, overlooks the possibility of just such variations developing over time and with a degree of isolation within what might have been originally a more homogeneous migrant group. More marked variations in dialect developed on the Chatham Islands after they were settled from New Zealand in the 14th or 15th century. There is a single piece of evidence at variance with the hypothesis that New Zealand was settled from East Polynesia. Part of the DNA record of New Zealand Kiori indicates a link with the rats of Fiji and West Polynesia. This suggests to Lisa Matisu-Smith, who undertook the analysis, that rats may have been introduced to New Zealand from a more westerly location before the successful human settlement from central East Polynesia. No evidence of West Polynesian culture has yet been found in the archaeological record, which supports the view that this contact may have been fleeting and not part of the organised settlement of the country. Nominating a date for the initial settlement of New Zealand is rather more problematic. A revision of carbon dates for the earliest New Zealand sites thus far investigated by archaeologists reveals none earlier than the 13th century AD. And one such site, at Tairua on the eastern side of the Coromandel Peninsula, dated to the late 13th or early 14th century, also contained the single unequivocally island Polynesian artefact found in New Zealand in an archaeological context, a pearl shell fish lure. Identical lures had been picked up previously from eroded middens in the same coastal region. While the latter have been detached from a datable habitation site, their presence increases the likelihood that the eastern Coromandel was one of the sites of first settlement, and that the first people there either came from tropical Polynesia themselves or were closely associated with or descended from those who did. The Kaharoa eruption, which originated from Mount Tarawera and cast ash over 30,000 square kilometres of the North Island, has been reliably dated at 1314 AD, plus or minus 12 years. And the first fossil pollen associated with significant deforestation as a result of fire in the North Island has been found at the same level and just below Kaharoa ash, indicating that the fires occurred just before and at the same time as the eruption. Other fossil pollen remains increase in the 14th and 15th centuries and coincide with the destruction of large areas of forest on the eastern coast of both the North and South Islands, particularly in Hawke's Bay and Canterbury. Given a human presence, and with it a greater likelihood of both accidental fires and fires lit to provide easier access to game such as moa, and given the sharp decline in the numbers of moa and other flightless birds over the same period, it is reasonable to associate these fires with human agents. It is also reasonable to date from these fires the first major human-sponsored modifications of the New Zealand landscape, and with them major modifications to flora and fauna. A 13th century date for the initial settlement of New Zealand is later than those given previously for the beginning of the Maori era of settlement. 800 AD is cited most frequently in the previous literature. But the earlier carbon dates on which this conclusion was based turned out to be verifiably wrong, and a decision to trace such settlement from the 1200s is more soundly based on the range of evidence currently verifiable. It is still an informed guess, however, and there is always a possibility that new evidence will provoke a further twist of the kaleidoscope that will move the settlement pattern towards different configurations. Where in New Zealand were the first landings made? The inevitable absence of concrete archaeological evidence for such an event. Original habitation sites were probably at river mouths or in sand dunes, and likely to have eroded or been built over in the era of European colonization, makes the question impossible to answer confidently. The discovery of the pearl shell lures on the eastern Coromandel establishes a connection with these early colonists, but not necessarily their place of arrival. Maori canoe traditions may have some relevance here, although the purpose of such traditions was to establish connections with specific places, resources and people, not to recount a disinterested history, and some of them may have referred to internal migrations within New Zealand, not to the journey from a former island home. Descendants of at least 4 traditional canoe groups, those of Tainui, Matatua, Horota, and Nukuteri, name the Eastern Bay of Plenty as their place of first landfall, and some go further, naming Whangaparāoa on the cusp of the East Cape as the place their ancestors first stepped ashore. And the unplanned arrival at the same part of the coast of one of the late 20th century canoes, accomplishing a repeat voyage from the Society Islands, increases the possibility that ancestors too may have first come ashore there. Other canoe traditions, 3, tell of fetching up on the eastern side of North Cape, and 2, of the northern Coromandel Peninsula. All are consistent with possibilities allowed by wind and tide, and with modern computer simulations. The fact that at least some of the crops that the colonists brought with them survived the voyage and initial settlement suggests that colonization from at least some canoes occurred in the warm upper half of the eastern North Island. Clusters of earliest known habitation sites, the northeast of the North Island from Hohora to the Coromandel Peninsula, both sides of Cook Strait, and the southeast of the South Island, provide another basis for speculation. Archaeologists such as Jack Golson and historians such as Bellich have suggested that these might represent resource islands, regions where early settlers chose to hunt, garden and gain access to mineral resources, for as few as 3 separate canoe groups which arrived in the country at more or less the same time. Such an explanation would solve the problem of how a group of colonists managed to spread so rapidly and apparently simultaneously from one end of the country to the other. One could then speculate that, as the early abundant resources of large birds and seals were exhausted, these 3 groups later joined forces and reproduced, only to divaricate subsequently into the dozens of groupings of the tribal era as populations grew and previously cooperative exploitation of remaining resources became instead increasingly competitive. Against that possibility, closer analysis of artifacts, fishhooks for example, has shown subtle differences in the material culture of the Hohora and Coromandel settlers. The growing consensus among prehistorians is that there are likely to have been considerably more than 3 foundation groups, that these groups would have explored the whole of the country rapidly to locate its mineral and food resources. In addition to the Auckland Islands in the south, people had visited Jackson Bay in southwestland by the early 14th century, and that they probably arrived within a short time of one another. Discussion of such possibilities will never amount to more than a juggling of hypotheses, but some certainties remain. The first New Zealanders were East Polynesian immigrants. They began organised settlement of the country around 800 years ago. Their descendants were the New Zealand Maori encountered and described by Europeans in the 17th and 18th centuries. And a much larger group of descendants still identifies as Maori, celebrates its identity and nurtures its confidence with Polynesian cultural memories, some of which date back to that time of arrival. For I shall not perish, but as a seed sent forth from Raiatea I shall flourish. In the 13th century, such messages served to prepare a people for a journey of migration. In the 21st century, they fortify the descendants of those same people for the journey of life. Far as it was from tropical Polynesia, New Zealand did not represent the terminus of 5,000 years of Austronesian, Polynesian migration. There were still further journeys to be launched. Mention has been made of a way station on Raoul Island in the Kermadec established from New Zealand, and of the extraordinarily close similarity of adzes found on Pitcairn Island to those found contemporaneously in New Zealand. There is also evidence that a short-lived Polynesian attempt to settle Norfolk Island may have originated from New Zealand. But the major voyage still to be made after East Polynesians reached New Zealand was on to the Chatham Islands, some 800 kilometres east of the South Island. Sometime in the 14th or 15th century, possibly after no more than a century's occupation of the mainland, a group of New Zealand Polynesians transferred themselves by canoe to this cluster of isolated, low-lying islands, directly in the path of the Roaring Forties. Here again, analysis of Kiori DNA is helpful. The tightly clustered nature of the genetic data suggests a single settlement of people at one time and provides proof that the source of migration was New Zealand. By the time that New Zealand Maori and the indigenous settlers of the Chathams came into contact with one another again in the early 19th century, thanks to European vessels, neither people had any surviving knowledge of the other, nor of their common origins in East Polynesia and on the New Zealand mainland. As a result of this encounter, the Chatham Islanders began to refer to themselves as Moriori, their dialectical version of the word Maori, from tangata Maori, ordinary people. The Chathams' culture had by this time diverged from that of Maori in several important respects. The islanders had a level society with no distinction between aristocrats and commoners. They had developed their own version of the Polynesian language. They had no horticulture because the climate would not allow the root vegetables Polynesians carried with them to grow there. And perhaps most significant, they had discarded warfare as a means of settling group disputes and substituted the practice of dual hand-to-hand combat, which would cease as soon as one party drew blood. Their material culture lacked the elaborations of so-called classic Maori culture, in particular intricate carving and a wide range of tools and ornaments, but was, in its pared-down simplicity, adequate to meet the needs of Chatham Islands inhabitants. Of the fact that Moriori were Polynesian and shared ancestry with Maori, there was, or should have been, no doubt. Their language was Polynesian, and, despite differences in pronunciation, shared many words with Maori and no other languages. They appeared Polynesian in their stature and features, and their skulls revealed the classic Polynesian rocker jawbone. Not only were their tools of the same East Polynesian style and variation as those of early Maori, but some of those found on Pitt Island would turn out to be made from New Zealand materials, obsidian and argillite. Despite this overwhelming volume and weight of testimony, some late 19th and early 20th century scholars convinced themselves and a gullible New Zealand public that Moriori were not Polynesian. Professor J.H. Scott of the Otago University Medical School reported that skeletal evidence showed that Moriori resulted from an interbreeding of Polynesian and Melanesian antecedents, and that the Melanesian element was stronger because the cranial capacity is somewhat less. A group of German scientists published a paper proposing that Moriori most closely resembled the extinct Aboriginal people of Tasmania. John Macmillan Brown, a professor of classics and English and a dabbler in ethnology and history, dismissed the idea that Moriori had any Polynesian ancestry at all. The most coherent statements about the relationship of Moriori to Maori, and, as it turned out, the most erroneous, came from the amateur ethnologists who were the founding members of the Polynesian Society, Stevenson Percy Smith and Elsden Best. Smith proposed in his second volume of The Law of the Whare-Wānanga, 1915, that Moriori were an inferior and dark-skinned people who occupied New Zealand prior to Maori, and that they were subsequently partly absorbed and partly driven out by the more intelligent and more enterprising later comers, who had arrived in New Zealand as part of a fleet migration from island Polynesia. Best, in a 1916 article in the Transactions of the New Zealand Institute that revealed collaboration with Smith, filled in further details. He claimed that Moriori were a people much inferior to the Maori in appearance and general culture, with thick projecting lips, bushy frizzy hair, dark skin and flat noses, with upturned nostrils. Their eyes were curiously restless, and they had a habit of glancing sideways without turning their head. This saga, with its lurid allegations of Moriori physical and mental inferiority, was assembled from contaminated and unrelated fragments of so-called Maori tradition. It had no basis in history or ethnology. Yet it was, as noted previously, published in the Department of Education's school journal and distributed to every primary school classroom in the country. This action, supported by subsequent publications which repeated the story, coloured public perception of the indigenous Chatham Islanders for the next 3 generations. Condemned by a late 20th century ethnologist as a virulent myth, the construct was a consequence of social Darwinist ideas current at the time of its invention. It explained the plight and demoralization of Moriori in the 19th century as evidence that they were an inferior people, unable to adapt either to the Neolithic world in which they had previously lived or to the modern age of European colonization. If they were, ipso facto, inferior to Maori, who had flourished in their pre-European society and showed signs of being able to negotiate the effects of colonization, even to assert themselves in the face of it, then the explanation must lie in Melanesian ancestry. This conclusion followed because it was believed that Melanesian skin colouring, the basis for the origin of that designation, hair texture and physical features all indicated a lower order of human evolution than that displayed by the more Aryan-looking Maori. Further, the very notion that Maori had displaced and colonised a more primitive people was both evidence of their superiority and an implicit justification for what Europeans, representatives of a still higher order of civilization, had done to Maori in turn. In colonising you and your country, we did no more than that which you had already done to Moriori. All the pleasing and convenient resonances of the Moriori myth ensured that it enjoyed a popular currency among Pakeha New Zealanders and among many Maori, long after it had been disproved by the Dunedin ethnologist Henry Skinner in the 1920s. After the virulent myth had been further demolished in more public arenas by a television program in 1980 and a professionally written history of Moriori published in 1989, another story, equally erroneous and equally innocent of evidential connections, arose phoenix-like from the ashes to take its place in the public mind. This new myth, seized on uncritically by the popular press, generated more reverberations that a new generation of New Zealanders in turn would find comforting. It was yet another variation on the notion that the ancestors of the Maori had not been the discoverers and first inhabitants of New Zealand. This time it was alleged that the honour and distinction of first landfall and footfall had gone to a group known as Waitaha, or more grandly, the nation of Waitaha. The ancestors of these people had allegedly sailed into the Pacific not simply from Asia, but also from Africa and South America. In a kind of cultural version of the geologist's Gondwana scenario, proponents of Waitaha said that the ancestral groups had brought with them concepts and technologies apparent in the earlier human histories of all those continents. The eventual discoverers of New Zealand had sailed there from Easter Island more than 2,000 years before Polynesians arrived. They were a peaceable people, in harmony with the land and the sea. Their secret history, hidden in the trees and in the stones, and withheld from Pakeha scholars for 200 years, would be published in 1995 as Song of Waitaha, The Histories of a Nation. The Waitaha myth presented a range of difficulties for historians and prehistorians. There was not a skerrick of evidence, linguistic, artefactual, genetic. No datable carbon or pollen remains, nothing that the story had any basis in fact, which would make Waitaha the first people on earth to live in a country for several millennia and leave no trace of their occupation. This lack of evidence, the story's proponents would claim, was because Waitaha stone structures had been mistaken for natural formations or Maori artefacts, and because their history had been kept secret from both Maori and Pakeha scholars. And, to confuse the picture further, elements of the story did have a basis in Maori tradition. There had been tribes in both the North and South Islands who used the name Waitaha. In the South Island, some of those genuinely descended from the Māori Waitaha people and the tribes which had subsumed them, Ngāti Mamoi and Ngai Tahu, embraced with enthusiasm a scenario which made them far more than one Māori tribe among many, a pre-Polynesian civilization which could be said to have prior rights over Māori. Some Maori from other regions who saw similar political and ideological advantage in the Waitaha myth also abandoned their previous and authentic tribal affiliations to become instead descendants of and spokespeople for the nation of Waitaha. For Pakeha supporters, and they outnumbered Maori, the story had multiple appeal. It carried on the popular Victorian notion of cultural diffusion, which held that any cultural innovation displayed by a primitive people, such as the Moai statues on Easter Island, had to have come from a more highly civilized people elsewhere. It incorporated the neo-Darwinist conviction that the representatives of higher civilizations were pale-skinned, as some of the ancestors of Waitaha were said to be. It supported New Age beliefs about the desirability of living in a sacramental relationship with the natural environment, the energies of stones and crystals, and abilities to derive information from cosmic consciousness, ley lines, and the Earth's harmonics. And it completely undercut contemporary Maori resource claims against the Crown by arguing that Maori were not in fact descended from the first inhabitants of New Zealand unless they also found and acknowledged Waitaha ancestry. In this last instance, the Waitaha myth became a neat substitution for that of Moriori. Maori did to Waitaha what Pakeha did to Maori. Therefore, Maori have no legal or moral high ground from which to argue for compensation for the effects of colonization. Not a single scholar, Maori or Pakeha, accepted the validity of the Waitaha nation scenario, and standard histories of New Zealand failed to dignify it even with a mention. But that in no way diminished its popular appeal. Media interest in freakish stories ensured that the public appetite for such stories was sustained. And to the myth of the secretness of Waitaha traditions could be added the allegation that reputable scholars sought to suppress the Waitaha story because it conflicted with paradigms on which their careers and employment depended. And so, for the initiates, the myth of the nation of Waitaha was sustained by a self-reinforcing circle of argument and delusion, of misperception and misrepresentation that permitted no admission of evidence or common sense from outside the circle.